Hello, everyone. We're back today with a new guest. She was introduced, or actually, the person that got us in touch was Dr. Sami Timimi. He was here maybe last year talking about how diagnoses are actual brands, and so it was a recommendation that I couldn't let go. I have today Brook Siem. She's the author of May Cause Side Effects, which is a biography about what she went through in her life, some crazy adventures and her experience with antidepressants. So, Brooke, tell me, what is the book about?
Yeah, so the book, it's called May Cause Side Effects, and it's effectively about my year in very severe antidepressant withdrawal. So this all happened to me in 2016, 2017. That's the time the book takes place. It was written in the years after, of course. And it's the first book on antidepressant withdrawal to be published by a traditional publisher and marketed for the mass market. So I'm very proud of that, because what few books we do have on antidepressant withdrawal and psychiatric drug withdrawal are really aimed at either clinicians or academics. And yet it's the regular people who are actually the ones who are experiencing this. And so far, they really haven't had any account, no real resource to read or listen to and say, oh, it's not just me, I'm not crazy. So I wrote the book that I wished I'd had when I was going through it. And, here it is out in the world.
Do you mind telling me what motivated you? I mean, well, you have the book. First of all, it's amazingly well written, and you describe how you go about winning Chopped.
Yes,
Blew my mind. You have everything, all kind of crisis going on, and then you see, I'm going to apply for this TV show and see what happens. I'm a cook after all. I can make cupcakes or something, and then you go and you win. And so I would expect you to be on a roll in general with life, but the book itself. What got you to say, you know what, I'm going to put this story on paper because people need, what was it?
I had some writing background. I did a lot of, I had written one more book prior to this. It was co-authored. I'm a cook, I'm a chef. I owned a bakery in New York City for most of my career. And we had published one book as a cookbook for our bakery, Prohibition Bakery. So I was familiar with the process, and I had gotten this kind of out of the blue opportunity to travel around the world for a year, which most people would have looked at, I think, and been very excited about. I looked at it as the parachute out of my life, because I was deeply depressed. I was having suicidal ideation. I had been on antidepressants for 15 years. I was medicated at 15, and then I was 30 when this all went down. And so I saw this opportunity not as a fun adventure, but pretty much as the only way out of a bad situation. And so I took the opportunity before I went into withdrawal. Had I known what was going to happen in withdrawal, I probably maybe wouldn't have taken it, but I didn't know. And so I was in withdrawal throughout the year that I was traveling. And when I got towards the end of the year, the book agent who had done our previous book, she and I had stayed in contact, and she said, I think you could write a book about your experience with your travels. And that was pretty poor advice at the time. Travel memoirs weren't really selling well, but I had left my business. I didn't have a job. I had nothing. And so I just kind of said, okay, let's give this a shot. And I kind of started off writing what I thought would more be a travel memoir, and it turned into a memoir about antidepressant withdrawal. And as I was writing it was when I first started seeing the first national coverage around withdrawal. There was a big article in the New York Times written by Benedict Carey, who I deeply, deeply miss his science reporting. from the Times, but the title of the article was "Many People Taking Antidepressants Discover They Cannot Quit." And that was published in spring of 2018. And when I saw that and I read it, I was, into the first draft of my book. And that was the first moment where I said, this is only going to grow. This is going to be a topic that is going to be important for years and years and years. And this book doesn't exist. So I felt like I had a chance at being the one to write that book. And so
I'm so glad you did. I'm so glad you did. It's a very, because we have in the field, we have a small percentage of us shrinks that have realized that something's off about the whole concept. And we're going to cover a few, I want to share some thoughts with you as well. But the way those topics are addressed, they're pretty much dismissed in training.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, those guys, I remember when I interviewed Robert Whittaker, I got to lose friendships because of that. Because
really?
Yeah, man, I'm not kidding. It's a
weird. Have you reached back out to them now that the WHO and the UN has come out with that report?
It doesn't matter what happens. Take my podcast as a sample. I have been talking to providers. I've been talking to professionals since I started this thing because I thought, well, we have Med in America talking to general public. We have a lot of smart people out there trying this, and they say, I thought naively that I could persuade people just by being smooth and presenting information. I have a mentoring institute designed for the same purpose, and those things happen. They grow very slowly, but when you see the reactions of people when you're trying, my colleagues, when they say, "Hey, man, did you know this?" It's a weird thing. So, that's why I was happy when we got in touch and say, hey, this is, more opportunity because, and if you remember one of the emails, I said, sound as cool as you can because there is a trend to dismiss any complexity in the field. And to, for example, it's easy to dismiss professionals as being out of their minds. And it's also easy to dismiss, in your case, a former patient, a former psychiatric patient, like an outpatient, let's say client or user, whatever service we want to freaking describe this thing. It's dismissed as, some people are like have personality traits, they're more dramatic and things like that. And I really liked your account because your account was honest and grounded. I want to ask you this. Can you describe yourself before you were 15 years old? Personality-wise, mood-wise, who were you then?
Yes and no. And there's a couple of reasons. The first one is that the reason why I was medicated in the first place was because my father had suddenly passed away.
Yes.
And the whole experience was fairly traumatic, and I had a lot of PTSD symptoms, including a lot of memory loss from about the year prior, and I would say pretty severe memory loss from about 2 years after. So I don't have much frame of reference for who I was before. I just kind of don't remember. And on top of that, because I was medicated from 15 to 30, in reflecting back, I mean, how many of us can really have an understanding of who we were at 14, especially if some big life event happened then, right? So I feel very little connection to the 14-year-old that wasn't medicated, which is the frame of, that's who I was. So most of my understanding of who I was at that time is gathered through secondhand accounts. I mean, basically talking to my, mother or close family friends because they knew me. But what I would say is that I was always a very intense kid. And felt very deeply. Didn't matter whether or not the emotion was happy, sad, focused, frustrated. I felt it very deeply, and that was a trend throughout my life before I got on the antidepressants, for sure. And then I feel like there was a dampering of all the intensity on all emotions as I was medicated. And then as I got off the medication, that intensity came back. But then it felt really inappropriate and really strong and really confusing because I had been so separated from it for so long. So I was very intense. My mom, moody for sure, not only because I was a teenager, but I just kind of am. I'm a little mercurial, and I'm okay with that. And but also, I was a happy kid too. I mean, I had interests and activities. I was not hanging out with the wrong crowd. I wasn't doing drugs. I was very much a trying to please, get straight A's, good kid.
And then reading your book and knowing of the loss of your father is, I'm not sure if this is a proper understanding of what you wrote, but you had a numbness, an emotional numbness after a short while before medications were started.
Mm-hmm.
Is that, I even remember there's a piece of your book where you say, a part where you say there was a cut, and you go to the emergency department, and for some reason that gets you in touch with stuff that God knows you're trying to cope with, and you just can't stop sobbing, and the doctor says something like, "I don't get it, it's just a stitch."
Mm-hmm.
Right. And I thought that was like, yeah, brother, we do that a lot, right? Because we fail so frequently to, it's not that we fail. You see this poor doctor, he's an idiot doctor, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's not that we fail to entertain the complexity of human emotions. In the field of psychiatry, we decided they don't count.
Mm-hmm.
We decided by applying this framework called the DSM in diagnostic and treatment, we decided that the nature of your experiences really doesn't matter.
Mm-hmm.
But then you're going through numbing. Would you say it was numbing when that happened?
So at the time, right when my father died, my mom and I were abroad. So we kind of got the proverbial phone call out of nowhere and had to leave all our bags where we were, and we were shuttled across the world as quick as we could get home. And then we come home to someone who when we left was at home. I gave him a hug, he was alive, and there was no indication that we were going to leave and then come back to, basically a corpse being kept alive by machines. But that's what happened. And so it all happened so fast, and it's only my mom and I, so I don't have any siblings. And it was in the middle of the summer, so I was kind of, I had basically 1 month, and then school started again. And I was just very stoic about the whole thing. And, in retrospect, I think two things were happening. The first was that I was a very, very serious ballet dancer. So I was training a lot, and I was taught that when you go on stage or you're in class, you're in pain. Your feet are bleeding and you don't have any toenails and it hurts. But on your face, you look like a fairy. You're light. You've got a smile. You're making art, and it's supposed to be beautiful. So I was very well versed in shutting down what was going on the inside so it didn't come out to the outside. That didn't mean I wasn't feeling things. But then at the same time, I think I was also legitimately just in shock. I mean, we mentioned the PTSD thing earlier. It was classic. I was in shock. So emotion wasn't really processing at the time. And that I think that's what was happening. I mean, I think in retrospect, I needed some time for sure. I think that no one really knew how to handle it, including myself. And I just kind of got wrapped up a little bit in the culture at the time, where these drugs had, were becoming approved for use in children and teens, and we were just kind of at the very beginning of this idea that we can medicate everyone if something bad happens to them.
And how long after that you ended up in front of a psychiatrist?
It was within 6 months. I don't know exactly the timeline. The records are long destroyed, but my father died in July, and I know that when I first went to the child psychiatrist, there were no leaves on the trees. I just specifically remember there not being leaves on the trees as we were pulling in. So that tells me it was winter or very, very early spring. So within about 6 months.
Okay. And what was like talking to a psychiatrist about this whole thing? Was there any
talking.
Okay. Was never like, listen, you lost your dad, your life is upside down, you have to learn to live in a completely different planet now that he's not around. Is like, I think Elizabeth Kubler-Ross would say that, now the task is, there's a new planet, you're just arrived to a completely new planet. Everything now is different because that person is, there's nothing, there's no, just so she's sad.
I like that idea of being on a new planet, because it's definitely feels
I wish I was the brilliant guy that came up with that.
Yeah.
That's Kubler-Ross. She was brilliant.
Yeah. So the slight caveat here is that I was taken to a child psychologist first, and I don't know how many sessions I had with her, but we did not vibe. It was not a good match. Did not like her. Did not cooperate. Admittedly, did not cooperate. And then because of all of that, she called my mother and said, "I can't tell you what's going on because of HIPAA, but I can tell you that what Brooke needs is a psychiatrist, not a psychologist. I'm diagnosing a depressive and anxiety disorder and recommending medication." And my mother, what was she going to do when she got that phone call? So she said okay and consulted with some of her friends, one of whom was a psychologist, not a child psychologist, just a general psychologist. And a name was given to us, and we just made an appointment and went. So by that point, my first experience in the world of mental health and clinicians was bad. I didn't want to be there. I was, at that point, fully bought into the idea that I was broken and that there was something, the chemical imbalance. There was something fundamentally wrong with my brain or different about it. Maybe not wrong, just different. Because I had been given this diagnosis, which at that point felt very real. It validated the fact that I didn't understand that I was living on a different planet at the time. I was trying to live in the old planet, and that wasn't working. And on top of that, I was 15, 16, and I wanted attention. And this got me a lot of attention. And I don't think we can ignore that aspect of teens and tweens who are getting a lot of pats on the head and attention for being, sick or ill or needing help in some way. So it felt very kind of satisfying to me in a very teenage way. And so, I wasn't informed of any of the long-term effects of antidepressants when I was 15 in 2001, that's for sure. They didn't even know, I'm sure. And so when they said, "Do you want to take these pills?" my thought process was that they were as innocuous as an Advil or an ibuprofen, so why not? And then also, this validates my feeling, it's not my fault, and I have a reason now for feeling the way I feel, a diagnosis. Here's all this attention from all these adults, and honestly, it felt good at the time. They didn't do anything. The drugs didn't do anything, but I wasn't that bad. That's the other thing. I wasn't suicidal at 15. My grades didn't plummet. I wasn't hanging out with the wrong crowd. I wasn't at risk of, getting pregnant. I wasn't out of control. I was just blue and my father had died and my grades maybe weren't quite as high as they were before. I think my GPA slipped from a 4.0 to like a 3.9. And that was kind of it.
I just can't believe the stuff you just said.
Mm-hmm.
I can't believe it. That you pointed out, because we see that happen, and we don't talk about that too much because we have a cancellation culture and all these things, but we see some ideological movements or commercial movements like is psychiatry catching up on adolescents. I've brought up before that you can find TikTok videos of kids teaching other kids on how to behave during a session, so they get specific diagnoses, and they're not even after candy like stimulants and stuff. Is just really. And I had a discussion with my last guest and collaborator. Actually, he used to be a guest, became a collaborator, has been helping me, Paul Andrews, where I said some diagnoses just became sexy, and it's became this banner that you march under, in a sense. Autism, ADHD, bipolarity, everybody's freaking bipolar. I'm surprised you're not diagnosed with bipolar after traveling the world, following a whatever seemed to be, or whatever they thought was a depressive episode.
Well, I never went back to a doctor to get diagnosed, so that's why.
That was smart. So then you were put on medications, and that's the same freaking combination you stayed for 15 years.
Yeah. Here, so let me tell you what I did, which I don't think I've talked about this publicly. So this was also the time when the internet was kind of really just coming out in a way where, everyone kind of had access. And there were all these live journals and blogs and things. And so, our parents didn't know what was going on the internet. I mean, no one did. It was just it was a wild west of beautiful and horrible experimentation. So this all happened to me right around the time that I got a car, or I just took my dad's old car, got my driver's license, and I was able to drive. So I was, I knew I didn't feel right. Like, I didn't feel like I used to. And so I was searching for the mirror to reflect back at me what I was feeling, right? And I had stumbled across these live journals where people were writing about eating disorders and all these, I don't remember them so much talking about depression and anxiety, but like they were talking about eating disorders specifically, and I was a ballet dancer, so I was reading these live journals and really feeling a connection with the way these people were thinking about, like it reflected how I was approaching food. It made me feel like I had a place in the world, and so I started learning about diagnoses. So then I'd drive myself to Borders Books, which, if you remember, I don't know if you remember Borders Books, but it was this wonderful competitor to Barnes and Nobles, which at the time had these big seats, like tucked away all into the bookshelves. So I would drive myself to the bookstore, order a large coffee that I hadn't eaten because that's what I was doing at the time. I'd sip on the coffee because it, kills your appetite. I'd go to the psychology and psychiatry section, find what I was interested in, and just start reading. I eventually found the DSM. Before, at that point, was reading through it, found the most interesting diagnosis that I thought could fit me, learned about those diseases, in quotes, and then when I went to the psychologist, sat there and was able to basically tell her, if I decided to cooperate, what I was feeling based on the rubric that I had come to understand, and very plain, simple language that was written at a book that I read at Borders. And so through that, I got exactly what I wanted. And I don't even know if it's what I wanted, because I wasn't angling for medication. I was just angling for some sort of validation that, like, I felt bad in my heart and didn't know what to do about it. And there was also a sense of manipulation. Here I was 15 years old. I didn't want to be there. That's what's all complex about this, is that I was both 15, didn't want to be in this appointment, and also wanted to win. And I wanted to be special. So I wanted to beat this woman at her own game, which was very easy for me to do because I'd read the book on the shelf. And so I effectively, like, I did meet the criteria for all of these things. That's true. I also manipulated the situation so I could get the diagnosis I want, to feel validated for the pain that I felt, and then they just happened to give me drugs for it, which was never really the outcome I was going for, because, you know, antidepressants aren't exactly like performance enhancers in the way that some of the stimulants are. But the fact that kids can do this now via TikTok in an even more quick way is insane.
Yeah, and you put in your book, you said, yeah, I was ripe for a diagnosis of an eating disorder.
Yeah.
Between quote marks. That's how you put it. And I was, one of the thoughts was like, yeah, that's how damaging this simplistic diagnostic. And I don't mind the existence of DSM. You know, if you need for research for something, because how can you do research? How can you possibly do research and say, okay, we found 1,000 15-year-old girls that just lost someone and their whole world is upside. So I understand the effort, or how it started at least. But yeah, it is a damaging thing to say, okay, I can, because at the end of the day, you read that stuff and your capabilities, and a lot of my colleagues will love me for that, but your capabilities of making a diagnosis are immediately the same of an idiot like me that went to school for virtually 20 years until I woke up and say, wait, you know, Skinner in the 50s was saying that context matters. Freud 100 years ago was saying context matters. As what is happening instead of what is that you're telling me, right? Two guys lose their jobs in the same day. One feels anxious, the other one feels defeated and depressed. Those are different diagnoses, right? So that was very interesting. Now, you're put on medications, you're left on them, and then at some point you start asking these questions: who am I off when I'm off antidepressants? Why did I kick?
Yeah, so I was put on a combination of Effexor XR and Wellbutrin XL. We had tried 2 other drugs before those 2. I'm assuming it was Prozac and Zoloft. The reason why I think it was Prozac and Zoloft was because those were the only 2 drugs approved for use in children and teens at the time. But I had pretty immediate side effects, physical side effects from each of those drugs, and so somehow we moved on and ended up on the Effexor and Wellbutrin, which did not create, you know, they didn't put me to sleep. And the other one, I think I was like, you know, my heart was racing like crazy. So physically, I felt a little bit more normal. But then over the course of the year after I had started taking the antidepressants, I started having all these other physical symptoms that no one really put this stuff together. No one said maybe your thyroid issues are connected to the antidepressants, or the gut issues. So I kept getting diagnosed with things, and then they'd throw a pill to deal with that one thing. So by the time I graduated high school, I was on 6 different medications, 2 psychiatric drugs, and then 4 drugs to deal with the side effects of, I don't know, either life or the drugs. Who really knows? I can hypothesize. But so then I'm in charge of my own medical decisions, right, at 18. I have now been on this cocktail for long enough to really have taken it as part of my identity. Like, I need all this stuff. I am inherently a sickly person. And, you know, I went to college and moved to New York City, and I was never happy. I was never thriving, but I was certainly, like, functional in the world. I was certainly able to exist in the spheres that I had created for myself, and, you know, I wasn't hopping around on, like, from small job to small job. I could hold a job. I lived in New York. I eventually started a business. So I kind of presented fairly well. But I was never, ever, ever happy, secure, or thriving. And I blamed a lot of that on being in my 20s for a long time. And then it wasn't until I turned 30 where I think that any decade birthday kind of causes you to think and reflect. So there was that. But the real thing was that when I turned 30, it dawned on me that my father had been dead for 15 years. And so I was about to enter the period in my life where I would have been alive without him for longer than I had been alive with him. And there was something that really bothered me about that. And that also meant that I was getting to the point where I would have been on all of these drugs and the antidepressants specifically for more than half my life because I was medicated so close to the time that he died. And that also really didn't sit with me because I was having like constant suicidal thoughts that were so normal. It didn't even occur to me that this was not how life was. Like, I never called the suicide hotline because I was never felt like I was in an emergency situation. It just was. I just thought about it all the time. So for me, it was just this kind of very small little light bulb moment where I said, I shouldn't be this depressed on this many antidepressants. Like, it's not working very well. And at the time, I thought all I needed to do was go see another doctor because I'd been getting my drugs from my GP. I thought, okay, I'll just go see a psychiatrist and maybe we'll switch it up, and that's what we needed. I still really deeply believed that I was fundamentally depressed.
Like biologically ill.
Fundamentally, biologically, like it was how it was going to be. It was the best I was ever going to get without those drugs. God, who knows how bad I would have been. I just figured, I don't know, maybe these ones have stopped working. Let's go talk to a doctor. I assume they would know more.
Mm-hmm. Were you ever? So okay, first I just want to ask you this. Yeah. So now you have been off antidepressants for how long?
7 years.
7 years.
7. Yeah.
The suicidal thoughts are, in fact, a very common thing. Uh-huh. A lot of people have them in the back of their head, like in a shelf in the back of their heads as a. Mm-hmm. As an alternative in case things get too ugly. Most human beings have that without even knowing that, if you need an example, which is a tragic one, you take into account 9/11 and people jumping off the window. So, like, now I'm going to do this myself. God knows what the experience is. But I have to ask you this. Do you still have that? And I apologize for doing so.
No, I'm happy to talk about this because I don't think this gets talked about in a very productive way. And then the fact that, social media and stuff censors it makes it even harder to talk about this stuff.
Either censor or glamorize. There's either a censorship of the topic or there's a glamorization of it. Yeah. And none of those things are really helpful.
Yeah. So the way it manifested for me during withdrawal is different than the way it manifests now. I would say that, like, walking around day to day, I don't have any real thoughts. But then every once in a while, you're driving on the highway and you just kind of think to yourself, what if I just turned my car right into the median or drove off the bridge, right? It's just like something that pops into your head and it's kind of gone quickly. And the first time it happens, that can be really destabilizing, I think. But I just think it's like we are conscious beings who are presented with so many different options of how we can live our life. It makes sense to me that we're going to experience the full end of the spectrum of possibility, and that, bottom line, it is one possibility. It's the fact that you think about it. I don't think there's anything pathological about that. I just think it's like, well, I don't think it's any different than, like, you're on an airplane and you think to yourself, this plane could crash, right? That's not considered pathological. But it's effectively the exact same thing, right? It's contemplating your own mortality. I guess in one case, you're potentially in control of it, and in the other case, you aren't. But it's still the most extreme version of a thought that you can put on a scenario. And so that still happens to me here and there. I will find that in times of really deep stress, or I would say it's more like if my kind of internal vibration is really low, like if I'm spending too much time around people or inputs I don't like, I feel like I'm picking up negativity, negative energy, I will think that stuff more. And that's usually my sign at this point, because I'm so attuned to it now, to change the way I'm interacting with the world, to, integrate more positive experiences, to get back on track, to stop talking to that person, to meditate more, whatever it is. I consider it a sign. It's part of the compass now that helps me navigate. But in withdrawal, the issue was that those thoughts came in very suddenly and with a violent bent that was very, very terrifying.
But you had it before you started to taper them.
No, the difference is that before I started to taper, when I was on these medications, it was more like, it was really non-dramatic in the sense that I was never alarmed by it. So I lived in New York City at the time, and I would take the which bus was it? I want to say the M32, but I don't think that's right.
It's a good sign that you forgot.
Yeah, I forgot. There was a bus that goes down 2nd Avenue, and there was an express, and there was a local. And I would often take that bus to work, like, every single day. And almost every day when I was standing waiting for the bus, I was standing on 2nd Avenue, and I'd turn and I'd see the bus coming, and I would just think, like, I could step out in front of it. And every single day that would happen. At least twice a day, getting on, getting off. Same with every time I was on the subway. Right? So and I lived on the 30th floor. I would look at the window and I could just say, like, I could fall out that. Like, but it was literally as innocuous to me as, I'm going to wear the yellow sweater today. Like, it was constant in the sense that it occurred to me a lot, but it was not, I never felt like it was a threat.
So this is interesting. The beginning of this year, a paper came up. And what we can expect in the upcoming months and years is there'll be a big, what's the word in English, dissing of antidepressants and antipsychotics, coming actually from researchers that work for pharmaceutical industry. And the reason for that is most likely because they have a new batch of stuff.
Yeah.
You gotta say the bad stuff was bad. Right, the old stuff was bad.
Are running out too, right?
They all, I presented to my staff because of my position. I was trying to convince my colleagues to prescribe less antipsychotics for patients that have that meet criteria for major depressive syndrome or generalized anxiety syndrome, because they seem to have a mortality that surpasses the mortality by suicide. So whatever excuses you have, the whole, all the authors of that paper, and justice to them, I usually go and see other papers by every author before to know what's going on, and they had serious papers for the most part, but they all had ties with pharmaceutical companies. But it is because obviously most are running out of patent except for the long extending, the extended release injectables. And the antidepressants now, we can see. So one of the papers that came up in the beginning of the year, one author had that I could find a link with pharmaceutical companies, but basically it was saying that they could show that, I think it was Celexa, in healthy subjects had an impact on what we call consequence-based learning, which is...
Oh, yes, I remember hearing about this.
Yeah, so there's different ways to translate that. So one, like the way that this friend of mine, Paul Andrews, he's an evolutionary psychologist, characterized, he said this is aversive learning, meaning the consequences are not affecting you anymore. Adverse consequences are not affecting you. So we don't have measurable or nominal cognitive impairment from the majority of antidepressants, in the sense that if you take an IQ test, we don't see a whole lot of difference to say, yeah, that's what's happening. But that's a very specific kind of stuff. Now, from a more lay perspective, if you're insensitive to negative consequences, it's the same as saying that you're inconsequential, that you can do stupid things. And we have known, even though suicidality is this gray area when it comes to antidepressants as potential cause of completed suicide, because suicide is a very low frequency event, so it's difficult to measure as such. But we know they are associated with impulsivity. A lot. We always knew, like everybody always said, well, it can make you impulsive, can make you inconsequential. And then when you wrote that, you always look into that window of yours and entertaining the seconds it will take to hit the floor and stuff. I was like, that's why I wanted to know if there was a change in the, and that's why I also introduced by saying, it's kind of normal. A lot of people do. I do myself here and there. And it's not like, like we don't stop the world because of those thoughts, because we have a flow of thoughts in our head. And in reality, we don't freaking control 10% of the crap that runs through our heads, right? Yeah. But very interesting that there was a change for you. The thought became, as a shrink would call, ego dystonic. It became unpleasant, because what the hell, man? When before it was just this simple thing being entertained by your mind.
Yeah, it's interesting you bring up the consequence-less aspect of it, because one of the things that I used to be told a lot by people, and my mother would always say it, she's like, God, you're so fearless. And I never felt fearless. I just felt like there wasn't any risk in a way. Like, so I would do stuff. I wasn't, like addicted to adrenaline, but like when I went skydiving once, and I did not I really did not remember having any real fear of it. And again, it was a combination of things. I think it was because I had been medicated at that point. So like the idea of jumping out of a plane and having it go wrong and hit the ground, I was like, sure, whatever. I mean, I don't really want to be alive anyway, so great. That's convenient. That's kind of how it felt. But then also it was like there was no biological fear. I had sort of like, oh God, I mean, it's very difficult to put into words, but I was just so low and on affect from anything that I wasn't fearful, so therefore there was nothing to really be worried about. But then the first drug I got off of was the Effexor, and I was on 37.5 milligrams. My psychiatrist said, well, that's the lowest dose on the market, so if you're going to do this, like, you're just going to have to stop. She prescribed me Prozac to bridge, which I did not take, and I just stopped taking the Effexor because at that point I didn't know about hyperbolic tapering because the word hadn't been invented. I didn't know about compound pharmacies. I didn't know about opening up the pill and putting it in half because I didn't really know about withdrawal. So she just said you might feel like you have the flu for a few days, and that's kind of it. So it didn't really seem like much of a risk, again, to stop taking it. So I stopped taking it, and within about a week is when the different kind of suicidal and violent thoughts started happening. And the difference there is that whereas the suicidal feelings and ideation I had while medicated felt like me. It felt like something within me that was not scared of dying, didn't want to be alive, and therefore made a very logical conclusion that here are my options. Towards death, if that's really what I want. So it was very, very logical. When I got off the Effexor, the violent thoughts in withdrawal sort of felt like I had like something coming from the outside. Almost, it felt more like a psychic assault. Like the thoughts were not logical. I could not control them. They were coming in constantly. They were prompted by all sorts of things. If I saw a knife, which I'm a chef, so if I saw a knife sitting on my work table, I would think about taking it and slitting my wrists. And it was so fast. If I was on the street and I saw somebody else, I would think about the ways that I could hurt them. It was really violent. It felt very aggressive, and it felt a lot more dangerous. Whether or not that was because I had never experienced it before, so it was just like, well, this is new, or if I was really worried that because of the severity of it, I felt like I was going to act on it. I don't know why it felt dangerous, but I certainly did not know that this was a withdrawal issue, that this was a withdrawal effect, that this was a sign that we had pulled this drug out of my body way too fast.
Did you go as far as considering, oh, my depression is back? Because that's the fallacy we face nowadays.
Eventually I got there, but at the time the intrusive thoughts were so extreme that I wasn't even considering depression. Depression would have been a welcome reprieve.
Okay.
From what I was going through. And so for me, it was just like, oh my God, how do I get through every hour of the day and, not hurt anyone? Because I was also, I had insight, as they like to say. I was aware that what was happening to me was that something was feeling really wrong. And I had so much shame, so much guilt over what I was experiencing in my thoughts that I didn't want to tell people. There's a chapter in the book where I kind of write about 1,500 words about what this felt like. It was one of the first things I wrote, and it never got edited. It came out exactly the way it ended up in the book. But it took me years to let anyone read that. My mother didn't really know about it. I was so afraid that she would judge me when she read that. I've been really nervous about talking about it publicly. It's taken a long time for me to be able to talk about this in a way where I'm fully confident that, I'm not a bad person. I was never crazy. This was a biochemical reaction from a poor decision made from a very powerful drug. That is what happened to me. And it was fundamentally different than the suicidal ideation I had while on the drugs. And it's different than I would maybe experience it now, where it just feels more like a fleeting thought, in the same way that, I think about the house that is across the street from me that happens to be tan.
This is so interesting. The aspect of the consequence, the emotional numbing, or so I was a psychologist before I went to medical school, and I'm very privileged to work either in my private practice or my current employment, that I have a lot of freedom. So one thing that, and it's crazy to hear you say that, but one thing that we face is, if you're using positive psychology, if you're, as I tell my patients, there's an ember in your chest, and we have to find and blow it until it becomes a fire. So we figure what you're up to in your freaking life, because people come, and this is a controversial topic. There's a specific ethnical population that is more bound to the concept of biochemical imbalance in psychiatric diagnosis. Mm-hmm. I work with a lot of Latinos and immigrants, and they have no problem understanding that their brains are fine and their lives are tough.
Yeah.
They have absolutely zero difficulty buying into this idea. So, so it takes looking at their medication regimen, explaining this possibility that, okay, first, to a bare minimum, the medication is not cutting, because you're sitting in your couch watching Netflix and you're not living your freaking life. And then, you use some aspects of some pieces of different psychological schools to say, hey, you have all these things going for you. You have a lot of strengths, and not only you're depriving the world of it, you're depriving yourself of a cool life. And when you start tapering the meds, then after a second, they say, I'm feeling things again. And now I know what I want to do. And it happens way too much for me to just think, yeah, this is suggestion. It just happens too much in front of my eyes. But is a task. At times a taper is a matter of months. And then people
Years.
start, engaging slowly in something and say, you know what, I'm feeling alone again. I'm feeling, I remember I wanted to be this of my life, or I'm thinking that old dream that I had about going to nursing school or becoming a CNA or whatever, or, oh, you know what? I should get a job or something. That inertia kind of ends. And so it's very meaningful what you're telling me, because you're feeling like, oh, maybe jump from this thing, maybe do that. Life was kind of a blah and kind of a gray. And I sense you had a rebound in terms of colors and creativity and thoughts, and sort of your brain says, okay, let's go completely crazy now. And then you describe all the situation with this winged creatures and stuff. But before we get there, a friend of mine that I interviewed last year, way in the beginning of this enterprise, he described, in the name of the episode, is janitorial psychiatry. It's like we really spend a lot of the time these days cleaning up what we find, right? What would you educate? How can you educate me and my colleagues that care enough about this thing, how to approach a patient that is on antidepressants? And the reason I ask is this: all the advertisement, commercial, ideological, political, most of the advertising, if not all, is focused on Caucasian Americans.
Women too.
Women, white Americans. Yep. White Americans are the freaking target. Every time I fail to talk sense into the head of a patient, I fail with a white American. For the most part, I have success. I'll tell you, I'm very, very lucky. But when it fails, when someone doesn't buy into, there's nothing wrong. There's nothing wrong with my life. I have a brain disease. When I fail that, and I also face a lot of fear, because, who's this crazy guy with a funny accent that is my fourth psychiatrist, that is the sixth psychiatrist, telling me that what all the other guys just added meds. Now this crazy guy, I don't even know where he's from, he is telling me to taper them.
Yeah.
So can you help me to do that better? Don't give up.
I mean, what a privilege it is to have a diagnosable mental illness, right? Let's think about what a privilege it actually is, right? It means you can afford to go see a doctor that probably costs $200 an hour. It means you can afford to get possibly not even generic, or not generic medication, but name brand medication that's very expensive. It means that, and I mean, this is not a blanket statement. I'm not trying to diminish anybody's pain here. There's very clear to me that there is a great deal of emotional pain across everyone, right? But I think where a lot of people in this demographic struggle, and I see it in my work, I'm sure I've felt it myself, is just that if we know that there are people out there who have lives that are objectively much more difficult than ours, and yet we are still in an incredible amount of pain. So how do we explain that, right? The only way to explain it is to put it into the biomedical model, where our experience is being validated in a way that politically is hard to argue with, right? No one can get mad at you if you've been, diagnosed with something and you're struggling, right? It just gives us a reason to struggle. I know that's how I felt. I mean, I was, I identified as depressed for 15 years, living in one of the most expensive cities in the world, owning my own business, living alone in Manhattan. That's a that's a treat in itself to be able to live alone in an apartment without a roommate. And so, but I was still so just not home and so distant from who I really was. And it was just excruciating. But the diagnosis explained it all. If you're someone who's not in that level of privilege, where you're living in poverty, you're living in institutional racism, you're living in a developing country, you're wondering, if your family's going to survive, you're in war. Well, interestingly, I mean, like, people's levels of happiness and contentment tend to go up during wartime, which is fascinating because most people have a bigger purpose. Johann Hari did a lot of research around that in his book, Lost Connections, which I found to be fascinating. But, not that we want to be in that position, but it just like, I needed a reason to explain my pain. And this was a very easy cookie cutter outlet. And I think a lot of people are in that position. And if you have grown up in a place of, more privilege, you haven't had to be as challenged as much. Like, the world's your oyster. You don't have to work as hard for things. You can, your parents are able to afford the toy you want, right? Like it's not that any of these ways are wrong or that one is bad from the other, but I think contextually we have to look at it and say, well, if we're refusing to let our kids feel any sense of discomfort because we are feeling for them and we want to take it away, we have to look at what that's going to mean when they're adults and they're in an uncomfortable situation. They don't know how to handle it, and now they've been pathologized and told that feeling bad is a disease. And so now we go get the medication that's very easy for us to do because we have this great insurance from our cushy job, right? Like, you can kind of see how it all ties together. So as a very general statement, obviously individual situations may vary, and all those caveats that I have to say so people don't get mad, and they still will. But as far as helping psychiatrists understand and better relate to their parents or patients, or the parents of their patient, Freudian slip there.
Yeah.
I think that, I think the easiest way to change people's minds is to kind of catch them in their own thinking. So this requires that you really know your patient quite well. But, I think, for example, like for people, let's say we're talking about people who are really, really science forward, where everything is about the science and, you're going to do this in your life because some research paper said it. Well, then show them the research, right? Like, ask them, if for whatever reason, they also have to want to get off of these drugs or whatever, that has to be part of their own motivation. But if you ask them to go home and to find a paper for you that shows the long-term benefit of antidepressants in an actual clinical trial, ask them to go find that paper. They won't be able to find it because it doesn't exist, right? They might be able to find a couple surveys or some basic questionnaires, but they're not going to be able to find an actual clinical trial. And that starts to get people thinking, right? Same goes for maybe they're not a research-based person at all, but they're not thriving, right? I mean, the question for me was, I shouldn't be this depressed on antidepressants. It's literally in the name. So maybe we need to look at that. Maybe we need to look at the role that these drugs are playing, where maybe they helped you through a short period of time, or maybe they helped you when you needed it. But, if your dad died when you were 15 and you're 30 now, well, 15 years have passed since that incident. Why are we being medicated for that same situation, right? I think that, and also I think the last thing is to examine how, and this is a hard question for people, but if you can get them to answer how being sick benefits them, sometime you can start unraveling that thread. And, maybe that's because it's getting them love from a relationship that they're desperate to hold on to. Maybe it's because it means they don't really have to face their lives. Maybe maybe they're lacking in a spiritual connection and we need to grow that. Maybe they've just got so much anhedonia from all the drugs. I don't know, but at some point you have to get the critical thinking wire.
Yeah, and that's it. That is a very every time you change, there's a loss, and knowing what is going to be lost is that's a psychotherapy axiom, if you will. Now, you mentioned something about those 15 years and the loss of your father, and I want to explain to you something that I've seen frequently when I was working with substance users. In addiction and whatever name we can give to this thing. But I have seen a lot of people that were, for example, on a 2-year, more and less on and off bender on something or a bunch of stuff, opioids, alcohol, whatever. Then experience a period of sobriety during a detox and then a rehab. And during that window, they start grieving the loss of someone who died 2 years ago, right? Now, you see, I'm not a guy that opposes drugs per se, right? I always say I find use for nicotine and alcohol, right? I don't smoke every day. It's something that I do every so often. And when I do smoke a cigar I shared that with a colleague, a friend from Australia, and he said they're safer than antidepressants because our discussion was this. I said, inducing impairment at times can be desirable, right? You see, I'm a moderate guy, right? I'm not very radical, right? I'm not saying don't do average drugs. I'm saying, hey, at times inducing impairment may be desirable. Because that's what the drugs are doing. Your brain is working as it was designed to work. You have a loss, you're suffering, or your life lacks novelty, or lacks excitement, or lacks a problem to solve, because we're designed to solve problems. In the absence of them, we make them up in our heads, which is a simplistic way to explain this thing. But it has 100 years of base, that statement. Or you're lacking meaning, purpose, whatever. But I said, there are moments where the desire impairment, that impairment in your functioning could be a desirable thing. Making your brain work a little bit different, although it was for a short window. The classic example I use is this. If you're feeling very alone and your heart is broken because you love someone, you don't talk to that person, and I prescribe you tequila every day, your life in 2 years, you're still going to be drinking tequila and missing that person because you never talked to that person. But if you decide you're going to talk to that person and you hit a wall because you're afraid, what if he says no? What if I say, listen, dude, I love you? And he says, I see you as a friend, and you get friend zoned, which is awful. But I say, you know what? That fosters movement, and the desired impairment now may actually help you. Here's a shot of tequila. Go and talk to this guy. Do you see? It's the freaking same drug, but the context is completely different. One is fostering stagnation, the other one fostering movement. But basically, what I saw was so frequently people living emotional pain that should have been lived 2 years ago, 5 years ago, or that they were exposed to within those 3-4 years in short doses, going through a rehab or something, and then they go back to their usual way of coping with reality, and that process stops. And I was dying to ask you this question. Forgive me if I'm being too daring. Did you feel anything like that when you came off of antidepressants? The pain of your father's loss of 15 years before, did that?
Oh yeah.
Was there a toll to pay for that?
Yeah. It was awful.
I apologize.
I know now that grief waits for you to do the work. It will always be there. There's no outrunning it. And I think we grieve so much more than death in this world. I think that's actually what a lot of depression is grieving all sorts of things. It's, grieving the loss of innocence in the case of, certain kinds of abuses. It's grieving the loss of even activities we've loved or homes we've been in or experiences we've had, right? And for me, I mean, I think that the intensity of my withdrawal was trifold. I think that the first was because I had been on these drugs for such a long time, and I think that there was a chemical intensity. It being pulled out so quickly that we truly had a chemical imbalance at that point, and just my body and the length of time I'd been on them, it was just too much for my body to handle. I think as well that because everything was pulled out so quickly and it was kind of like jumping into a hot tub from being very cold where it just hurts, on an emotional level, all of the grief that had not been processed from my father, combined with all of the things that had happened to me over those 15 years, which included the loss of two very important people and the realization that I had spent 15 years living a life that was bad for me and having to grieve that realization that my 20s were gone. I could not get that back, and I didn't feel like I wanted any of it. And so much was affected. I mean, we haven't gotten too much into PSSD or anything like that, but like there was that whole aspect of my life too, like, sexuality, the relationships, the amount of relationships that I didn't have or lost because of not being able to connect with another person still pisses me off, right? So then I had to deal with that. Then you toss in the fact that I was already I'm an intense person, which I had known because I have been intense since the day I was born, according to my mother. Having that intensity, suddenly feeling it for the first time as an adult, all those three things together just made for, a minefield for me. But the grief definitely returned. I think it's far worse, in my opinion, to deal with retroactively because you can't put your life on hold in the same way. You can't call your boss, or in my case my business partner, and say I'm not coming into work today because I'm grieving my dad. Oh, it happened 15 years ago, right? Doesn't work quite in the same way. But that doesn't mean it doesn't feel the same or need to come out or be processed. So, if we could go back in time, I'm quite sure we would have made the same decision because we made the best decision with the information we knew we could at the time, or we had at the time. But there were a number of opportunities along the way where I feel like I was failed by professionals who should have looked at my situation and said, it's time to come off of these because it's time for you to face this. And it didn't happen. Whether or not I would have heard it, I don't know, because it was never suggested. But I really wish someone had given me the option, or at least tried to talk to me about it in a way that maybe could have positively impacted my life, because I think I wouldn't have lost so much if I had gone through this process earlier on all levels.
That's very impactful. And I really appreciate you sharing that. I really do. And sorry for asking. I can't resist.
No. That's what we're here to do.
On a lighter note, yeah, and I feel in general people are ripe for the change. I can feel like from one year to the next that folks they have been exposed, they have been diagnosed, and then there's just a new paper on JAMA saying that diagnosis and treatment actually worsens a whole lot of parameters, work, poverty, and things like that. And of course, if it's taking away your fire, life is already difficult when you're willing to cope with it. What to say when you're feeling numb. But on a lighter note, I hope it's lighter. Did you feel a rebound of creativity?
Yeah. So that's really, I think, for me, I mean, in some ways I feel so lucky. Like, honestly, when I'm at my life now, and there are a bunch of question marks in my life right now that have been just like colossal pain in the ass. and have created a lot of stress. And yet I still kind of sit in my bed at night and think to myself, like, God, I feel like the luckiest person in the world and just so happy to be alive. And that feeling started coming back very early in my withdrawal process, but it came back in ways that were so unexpected to me, because I was aware that the drugs had been really numbing my emotions. I was not aware that they were numbing my entire system and my perception of the world, specifically my senses. Like, I did not understand that my visual field was different on drugs than it was going to be off. I did not understand how my hearing was going to change, my skin changed, the tactile sensations, everything, even my taste changed, which as a chef was baffling. And when I got off the Effexor, within a matter of days, I had this moment where I felt what I describe as the cellophane kind of lift off. And again, I didn't know that I was covered in all the cellophane. And then one moment, it's like literally the whole world changed. The whole world, how I perceived it, completely changed. I was outside. There were headlights coming towards me, and I was staring at them because it was about dusk in New York. And they went from looking like fuzzy orbs to really angular stars. And it just happened. And at the same time, I felt like not only that someone had turned the volume up on the world, but that someone had turned up the complexity. Like I was hearing more detail in the sounds of the street than I had been in the moment before. And it started to rain, and I felt the rain on my skin, and it was hitting really hard, and it kind of hurt. And I just kind of stood there with my arms out, and I was like, what is happening to me? And color too, everything, the saturation of color turned up. And it was this moment of realizing, oh my God, these drugs have affected so much more than just my, unhappiness, right? I hadn't yet been into the really difficult parts of withdrawal. I didn't know what was coming, but just knowing how they affected my physical symptom. And then I started walking around the world, and it was literally like, one morning, I think within a few days of that, I went to go make coffee like I had been doing for 20 years. And I go and I open the coffee and I smell the coffee. And like I literally smelled it in its entirety. And I just remember standing there thinking to myself, I don't know if I've ever truly smelled coffee in my entire life. And I just stood there with my nose in the bag, taking it all in, And it was the same thing, like I'd look at a painting or a flower, and I would just I specifically remember the magentas, like look at these kind of variations of red, and I would just stare at them because I had never really seen that color before. I had perceived a variation of it, but I hadn't seen that. And that just kind of set me off. And, especially during withdrawal, like, the way I experienced the drugs is they made me sleep a lot. So I could easily sleep 10, 12 hours a night and take a 3-hour nap every day. And just, it was great. I didn't have to experience the world. And then in withdrawal, that stopped happening. And I had the opposite problem where I couldn't really sleep. I also couldn't listen to music because it was too much input. I couldn't watch TV because it was too bright. And so I'd be up in the middle of the night and didn't know what to do. So I went and bought some watercolors, and because they were cheap, and I just started painting. And I was trying to paint with the color and just kind of be around the color. And I remember feeling like I've wanted to be I have felt like I was a creative person, like I was an artist, but it just kind of felt gone, and it was starting to come out. And I was able to start writing in a way that I wasn't able to write before. I had attempted some writing because I knew I had an innate talent for it, but I would give up. There was just nothing. The well felt dry. But then I was able to start writing what would eventually become a book, and now I can write very easily. I have a whole painting studio right here off to the side. I still look at, I want to paint sunsets all the time because of the magentas in there. And I'm an artist at the end of the day, and that was completely gone while I was medicated.
Do you feel, I always struggle, because one thing that I struggle with psychotherapy is that compared to other forms of art, we fall short at inspiring people to embrace change.
Mm-hmm.
At times I found myself in this situation since I got out of psych grad school and started to see patients in Brazil, where I would work on something for months and months, and then patients would come back and say, "Hey, I did this thing," and I said, "What happened?" Hoping, because I was young, my ego was much bigger than now, and hoping to hear some nice thing about our work, and they would say, "I heard the song, I watched this movie." And I was like, damn it. And about 20 years later, I realized, it's our art is not that good at it. And I started to focus on that. I started to actually read about these things to incorporate into my private practice, or into my clinical practice, I should say. How can I inspire people to see the million possibilities that reality is made of? Because when people are feeling cornered, that black and white thinking, everything sucks, they don't realize that reality is virtually infinite. Good, crazy. Look at you. I mean, you're like, oh man, I'm going to jump off the window. But no, today I'm going to win Chopped on TV. So that kind of knowing how rich life can be is always a challenge, to sell that. And of course, I'll tell you that it can be perfected. I think psychotherapy and psychotherapists and shrinks listening to this thing, trust me, man, you can perfect this. It gets much better if you start focusing on selling freaking hope and movement and, fostering that kind of stuff. But do you feel your ability to see that world of possibilities, like you're comparing yourself now, looking to the world and reality, and comparing yourself 10 years ago when you were on meds, was there a blunting of that kind of inspiration as well, or that hope?
Yeah, 100%. And I wouldn't even say it's so much hope. I think, I talk about hope quite a bit, especially in the book, but from a more practical level, I think it's about blunting curiosity. I think that curiosity is what makes life rich, because it's what motivates us to go out and learn. And when you learn, different things, the world becomes more interesting. I'm going to go back to painting as my example here, where I have been focusing a lot over the past year on painting clouds. As you can see, that's a cloud. I did that.
Good job.
That's a cloud behind me. Clouds and sunsets, and for me, it's because I just want to paint beautiful things in kind of places I wish that I could transport myself to. So when you're starting to learn to paint clouds, you have to look at clouds, and you have to study how the light reflects against them very differently, because it gets diffused, and the perspective of the cloud being flat when you're flying above it, and then it goes like this when you come on the ground. And what happens is that now, almost every time when I'm outside, which is frequently because I have a dog, so we go for walks, I'm just standing staring at the clouds. We're walking, I'm staring up, looking at the clouds and being interested in the clouds, trying to think, how would I paint the clouds? Could I paint this cloud? How is the light coming through when I go try and paint? How can I take the interest in this cloud back into my life? And that happens for me now all the time, because one of the things that I adopted in my recovery, I guess, as we'll call it, is I started a tradition where every year on my birthday, I pick an activity that has nothing to do with my work. That is the only rule. There are two rules. The first rule is that it can't have anything to do with work. It cannot benefit towards my money making in any way. And two, I have to take lessons, at least 10 lessons of the thing. And so that's my birthday present to myself. And it has made my life so much richer, because I have taken sword fighting lessons. I've learned how to bind books. I've taken formal swimming lessons, because I wanted to learn to do the butterfly. I've taken cross-country skiing lessons. I've done painting, singing lessons. And what happens now is not only am I a more competent person, I'm a more interesting person, because if someone's really into paint or really into swimming, I can have a conversation about it. But more than that, it's that the world is more interesting. Like, oh, if the world championships of swimming are on, I can watch it because I have some understanding of what it's like to do it and to learn it. And I have a lot of respect for people who do it well. And it doesn't just feel like a thing that I'm not interested in anymore because I did it. When I listen to music, there's so much more depth to it. And things I used to think were like really kind of easy, crappy pop or something, I've tried to sing that. I'm not good at it. It sounded terrible. I have so much more respect for those artists now because I've tried to do what they do. You know, most of the things I kind of, abandoned after my 10 lessons because I'm like, I'm glad I did it, but we're good. But then every once in a while, I find something like the painting where this feels like me. And now this is going to be a lifelong thing. So the struggle is that if you've spent a lot of time on these medications and your emotions are numb, your physical body is numb, your senses are numb, what in that equation makes you want to be curious about life when you can't really internalize any of the wonderful things that are out there because you can't feel them, and so therefore you have no desire to spend the time to do it, and so we plop ourselves down in front of video games or eating chips and booze because it makes us either feel something or feel nothing. And then I see that, God, I see that so much with people. But it's tricky. It's a muscle. You have to learn what it's like to be creative. You have to learn what it feels like to be curious. You have to just suck it up and pay some money to sign up for a thing that you might hate just to break up your own assumptions about it. It's a huge challenge, but the more you do it, the better it gets, and the better you get at understanding yourself and seeing why I can just sit outside for an hour and stare at the clouds and like literally be interested in it.
That's very strong. I really appreciate it.
Yeah.
Two things I want to say. One is you got to try jujitsu.
I tried one class in jujitsu.
You did? Yeah, maybe too much. And the other one is I want to thank you for your time and ask if you want to wrap up with anything about, whatever I want to tell my colleagues that are listening. I have a very modest audience on Spotify and YouTube, but what happens is my efforts to persuade my colleagues were not as successful as my efforts to select them. And, considering the feedback I get from listeners, they're very thoughtful, very smart, and people that have taken the red pill, as one of them has said. Do you have any final comments about it?
Yeah, I really wanted to come on this podcast just because I think the discussions you've had are really smart, they're really important, and I think that ultimately the change in this movement is going to come mostly from patients, but we really need as many clinicians as possible to get on board. And so I would really hope that whoever's out there listening would buy and read my book, because if you read it, it's not a demonization of the industry. It's simply asking, it's designed to ask us to question our own thoughts a little bit, but also, like, if you're a clinician, I imagine that you got into this to help people. I think that's why 99% of you guys do it. So this book, at the very least, will help you better identify psychiatric drug withdrawal, help you understand what your patients are going through. Perhaps, maybe it will, inspire you to make some changes in your practice, maybe not. But even if it doesn't, you will at least have a better understanding of what this can feel like and what it can look like, in the same way that the bell jar is considered, a hallmark of an understanding of what it's like to be depressed for someone who's never really experienced like deep deep depression. So I hope that it can have that effect. I would encourage you to share it with your patients, with parents of patients, with other clinicians and prescribers. And then I would also just really, really, really encourage you to understand that even though a lot of people really buy into the typical biomedical model, they are also just trying to help themselves, right? So by continuing to show up and talk to you, they are still searching for an answer. And I think that two heads can really be better than one. And if you come together as a team, that is always going to be stronger. I know that I felt really dismissed and abandoned by every single medical doctor I had in the world of psychiatry for the entire time I was in it. And that made me feel like I was alone. It made me feel even more like these diagnoses were correct, when I really, honestly, if I had you as a psychiatrist
In the last 3 years,
I
I was as blind as I could be before.
Well, if I
Yeah.
had the you of today, I don't think that I would have the same story. So it's just about everyone needs to be open. It's a two-way street. I don't blame you guys for being in the position you're in. Like, especially in this country, you're fed into a system that's quite frankly shitty, given that, psychiatric drug withdrawal is not even taught in most medical schools. I mean, like, how can I blame the doctors for just wanting to help and then being fed bad information? So I just, keep an open mind, keep that curiosity that you had going into medicine in the first place, and just question ideology all the time.
Very good. Very good. So folks, May Cause Side Effects. It's not only a very well written book, it's a lot of fun to read. It's also a tale of the richness of the experience that life can be, and also of what most of our patients may be going through without under our freaking nose, without us knowing. And in addition to that, we have a lot of things to learn from this book about antidepressant withdrawals. Brooke,
Yeah,
thank you
I
very
would
much.
also say thank you. So the book's available wherever books are sold. It's also an audiobook as well. And because I know that there's a lot of clinicians out there, like, don't make me regret this, but feel free to reach out if you have any questions. Please be nice. You can find me all over the internet at Brook Siem, BrookesIem. And I think, this is all, it's all fixable and possible if we just work together a little bit and understand each other's experiences a little bit better. So thank you for having me.
No, thank you for your time. Thanks a lot.